As you're aware, many African countries have already implemented reforms in one form or the other. Some have done it voluntarily through having identified some bottlenecks in their systems and wanting to improve electrification in their countries. Others have done it as part of a broader structural adjustment programs. This happened over the past 2.5 decades across the continent. We take an audit of how the electricity markets look today and find that while there's been a lot of action in this area, the progress that has been made in moving the markets towards competition is actually quite marginal. Just to give a few examples, a few statistics, about 20% of the countries are still operating monopolies. About half of the countries have moved just one step from a pure monopoly to an area where the generation segment of the market has been sort of opened up to include independent power production. But there's interesting also progress that has been made by about 30% of the countries on the continent, which have done deeper reforms. And I think those of us that have been here throughout the week, we've had examples of Kenya, who's done unbundling of its power utility and so on. It's one of the countries that sits in the 30%. So these countries have partially or fully unbundled their national utilities. Some of them have implemented, let me say one or two, have implemented partial divestitures as well. We also find that as this reform has taken place, many countries have put in place an independent regulator. About 2/3 of the continent has put in independent regulators to monitor the operations of both the vertically integrated or unbundled utilities as well as the private investors that are coming into the market. We find that tariffs remain predominantly government-controlled. There are various forms that this type of control take, and that there's level of subsidies, or the countries that have some form of subsidy in place, funded from the fiscus, is actually the majority of the countries. In terms of performance, what we find also is that private sector participation has clearly improved generation capacity on the continent. Our statistics show that between 1990 and 2013, about 10 gigawatts of generation capacity were installed through independent power producers, just counting those projects that were operational when we did the assessment, not counting the projects that were in pipeline, which is another large sum. However, when it comes to meeting access objectives of countries, we don't see a strong correlation between this improved private sector participation and access objectives. It would seem as though much of the generation capacity that has been stored to date has been to meet demand deficits for the clientele or the customers that are already connected to the grid to a large extent. We also find that actually countries that made more progress in terms of electrification did so under government-funded initiatives or government-championed initiatives, so to speak, where the government had an electrification campaign that had a lot of public finance going into it, but may or may not have private sector investments coming into it. What this suggests is that there are still some bottlenecks in the current market arrangements. We are trying to understand what it is that restricts the generation capacity that increase from helping countries to achieve their access objectives. I think some of the reasons we already tease out in the report. I'm not going to sort of discuss them here because I think we would like to give our panelists a chance to tell us what they think on this subject. But I think one of the key, when we did an assessment of not just the 7 or so countries in Africa that have reached universal access, but also other countries across the globe that have managed to accelerate electrification at the pace that the New Deal on Energy is envisaging, we see that the role of the government being a dominant role. And I think one of the questions that we or our panel should help us to understand is what is the optimal role for African governments in this thing. So, for example, we see that well-thought-out plans, electrification plans, a private sector entity or entities championing the electrification program has been sort of like a constant in a number of the countries we reviewed. Certainly in the North African countries that have reached universal access, and also in the few island states that have done so on the African continent. One of the areas that we thought this panel discussion could help us get into is the issue around the potential risks that still exist in the current model of market arrangement. I'll just mention a few here. So what we know is that a lot of the generation opening up that has happened under a PPA model, a power purchase agreement model, often with fixed tariffs. Not always, but often with a fixed tariff or with at least a feed-in tariff that everybody knows at the beginning, and often with government guarantees. And that has increased the contingent liabilities that government take on their books. Sometimes, actually, the lack of fiscal space, and we've seen this in a few projects that the bank has tried to finance, or has proposals that the bank has looked at. We see that sometimes the lack of fiscal space has actually made it difficult for countries to be considered bankable. So it's clear that we need new ways of managing offtake risk, especially if we're going to stay in this single buyer model. But perhaps we also want to hear from the panelists and from the audience what other models the governments could consider. Another sort of potential risk that I want to talk about is the increasing subsidy bill. Because also with increasing electricity, be it generation or access, you also inevitably increase the subsidy bill if your tariffs are not cost reflective. Again, going back to our own experience with the projects we've evaluated at the bank, you find that one of the perhaps unexpected results or developmental effects of IPPs is that in some cases they actually increase the subsidy burden on the government. So again, this is an area that we think the panel can help us to think through. How do we manage this? What is the optimum level? Should subsidies actually be part of this arrangement of accelerated electrification or not? Normally, when we talk about reforms, we also have an objective to mobilize more, innovative sources of financing. And what we found in our studies that for on-grid solutions, the innovative sources of financing outside of government bonds, which of course have their own risks, I think we've heard about that as well during the course of the week, and we hope the panel will discuss this, have been limited to countries that have sort of deeper capital markets. So, for example, if you look at the extent to which private equity funds have engaged in the power sector, you find that they tend to be in middle-income countries, your South Africa's and North African markets and so on, and far less in the less developed countries. And again, we would like to see if we can come up in this discussion with some complementary reforms that could be taken on board or that are required in the countries to mobilize more domestic and international savings into the energy sector. One of the things, we also did an analysis of the off-grid solutions, and one of the things that comes out of this analysis is that yes, there's definitely more innovation that you can see from this particular option in terms of both the financing and the payment systems. That also these systems or this solution is present in a broader spectrum of countries, from middle income all the way to transitional states. But I think one of the challenges we still have with this is there's still not, at least to our understanding, not a standard model of how to do off-grid electrification. There are all kinds of different models that are out there. Cooperatives, aid-funded initiatives, private sector that have metered systems, and so on. We also see that the regulatory framework in the energy sector still remains predominantly focused on on-grid solutions. So I talked earlier about the power purchase agreements. A lot of countries are putting these in place. A lot of countries are feed-in tariffs. But when it comes to the off-grid solutions, we don't see a similar comprehensive approach to actually putting in the legislation that tells people this is how you do off-grid in this particular market. Maybe just to conclude, I can touch briefly on the role of the regional power pools. Because, our analysis shows that, well, while we have the 5 regional power pools, the market arrangements differ significantly from one power pool, or at least the level of sophistication, the level of trade that takes place in the power pools is not the same. There's the variability across the 5 power pools. But perhaps in each of those arrangements, there are certain power pools that have made somewhat significant progress. Southern African power pool with its spot market, the day-ahead market. And we want to know, is this market arrangement optimal or not? We want to know what should other power pools envisage or try to get to? What kind of model should they try to get to? And hopefully our esteemed panelists will help us to understand this. I think with respect to some of the models that other regions have used to sort of get over the single buyer model or the concentration of market power in one utility in one country, a utility that may or may not have the financial capacity to drive the electrification progress, has been actually to refer to the regional model. So hopefully our panelists and the audience can help us to think through some of the reform proposals that can come in this area of regional markets. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Emily. A round of applause for Emily. And I think you have set the pace for us there very well. And just will quickly introduce the panelists who are here. We have Mr. Victor Mundende, who is the Managing Director of ZESCO Limited here in Zambia. And we have Ms. Nancy Lee, who is the Deputy CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Professor Mutuli Ncube, who is a professor at the University of Oxford, is also the former Vice President and Chief Economist at the African Development Bank. And finally, we have Professor William Liakurwa, who is the Chair at the Tanzania Investment Bank. To our panelists, welcome, and let's, in anticipation, let's give them a round of applause. I think it gives them encouragement. Then you really can, the juices will then flow of what we need to do here. I want the discussion to be very conversational, to be very practical. I think Emily has given us a lot of meat to chew on. But let's start with that first question. The evolving role of the state from supplier to facilitator. That's just a statement that's put out there. And maybe I want to start with you, Professor Mutuli Ncube, and say, is that a swear word? That statement I've just made, is it a swear word?
No, it's not.
It is not.
I agree with it that the role of the state should evolve, and it is evolving.
Okay.
Absolutely, in many ways. I mean, there was a time when government was the provider of this public good called electricity to everyone, subsidized rate and so forth, and we've moved on from that. And one can see a government playing a different role, for example, in investment in the generation space, where governments are increasingly getting involved in public-private partnerships, partnering with the private sector in investment in generation, which means that their exposure and the fiscal demands on government are getting lower and lower, and then that's a good thing. That's good. So that's one thing that has happened. But I don't think government can completely get away from transmission. When it comes to investment in transmission, that's where government is still needed. I'm not sure that the private sector has completely figured out how to get into that space. But also that's the space where DFIs such as the African Development Bank are active. I was reading about, because I only came in yesterday, about the loan, or is it a grant that the bank has extended to the West Africa Power Pool for a transmission line between Benin and Nigeria. That's the kind of place where governments and the DFIs should be involved, and finally distribution. There's also a role for government in regulation, absolutely. make sure the market is competitive, how to handle the independent power producers who come into the market, create a level playing field for entry and exit in setting tariffs. They should play that role. But quite clearly, the governments still need to think about the regulation of off-grid energy supply in rural areas. There's no conversation about that yet. There should be a conversation about that, because that will also spur on the growth of the off-grid energy market, which is much needed for rural electrification and also the SME sector in the urban areas. On the financing front, government still has a role, but not a huge one, especially when it comes to, I think, launching infrastructure bonds for funding energy, for example. I think that it's one thing to say the markets are not deep, which is what the FDB studies find. The markets are not deep, so governments cannot launch these instruments and so forth. But actually, it's an opportunity to deepen the markets in the first place, because that's a good thing. That's a public good. It's important that we should have a deep market for debt, and in launching infrastructure bonds is critical. But what needs to be done is these bonds have to be ring-fenced for specific projects. The projects must be clear upfront, and the money shouldn't be diverted for anything else. It should be really targeted, ring-fenced. That's the way to do this. So government still has a role. It has to evolve. It is evolving. Finally, on the regional front, obviously governments and the utilities have to play a role in constructing, managing, contributing, being a part of the regional power pools. The Southern Africa power pool, I think, is beginning to really work quite well. I watch the prices, the intraday demand, activity, both volume and pricing, and you get a sense that the market is able to clear whatever deficits there are in the market from the surplus. And the challenge is making sure there is a system that is able to match the deficit and the surplus within the power pool. There's also a challenge about transmitting whatever surplus to the deficit country. That is also a challenge. Just doing that is a challenge. I'm also seeing the growth of more innovation in Southern Africa through introducing a one-day forward market, 1 week forward market, 1 month forward market. All that is designed to ensure certainty in terms of pricing and supply. So it's all going in the right direction. But Southern Africa is a feather ahead, compared to East Africa power pool or indeed West Africa power pool. Those still have some way to catch up. Stop here.
Somewhere. Quite a lot you brought up there. But Nancy, I wanted to just again come back to the initial question that I asked for the rest of you. The issue of this role of government involving. You are in this space. You are in the space of really going on big projects. What are you sensing? And what would you like to see? Is this evolving state we are in, where government must just be seen in being really leveling the playing field rather than being an all actor in the space?
It's a critical question, and let me start by relating it to a critical feature of the MCC model, which is country ownership. So we don't approach the subject with a preconceived view of the optimal structure for a power sector. As Emily was describing, there are different structures that have worked in different contexts. And we enter a country without a preconceived reform agenda, but rather once power is identified as a binding constraint to growth, we sit down with the country and work out the steps to reaching their goals, and their goals now really always include making this sector investable by the private sector. So we don't have a preconceived reform agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm really,
the fancy
really
mic is not working
now. But I'll tell you, to answer your question very specifically, there are sort of 3 very common objectives that we're finding really across the board in all of the countries in which we have power sectors, power compacts, and at the moment we're working in Malawi, Liberia, Ghana, and Benin. So here's sort of the iron triad. The first is you need a commercially viable
and an efficient functional utility. It can be an unbundled utility, it can be bundled utility, but it's got to be commercially viable, financially viable. Number two, you need fair and transparent rules for access to power procurement, even if it's by a government entity, and access to the transmission network. Number three, you need stable, predictable rules for tariff setting. The private sector needs to understand how the tariffs are set. Hopefully they're set in a way that recovers costs, and it's got to be stable. So those three things, I think you can say across the board, whatever the structure of the power sector, that's the bedrock. And we're finding in the countries we work in, there really is a willingness to take on those issues. Those are hard issues to take on in many cases. Utilities often, we begin in our work with countries, we begin with utilities that are really not financially viable. They have to be restructured. There are arrears. There's a lot of intergovernment arrears, which in the context of fiscal constraints are hard things to address. But if you approach these reforms in a way, in an organic way, where the reforms grow out of the objectives that the government is seeking, as opposed to imposed from the outside, we're finding that we can be much more effective.
Well, what do you find, just to make a follow-up question, what do you find to be the struggle with most governments when it comes to the issue of, Professor Ncube spoke about this on, government maybe should concern themselves with the issue of transmission rather than generation. The struggle on letting go of that control, what is it?
It's an essential uncertainty when you're moving from one system to another system. You're moving from a system which isn't actually working well in most cases. There isn't enough generation in most cases. There certainly isn't enough access. So we know there's a problem, but then there's the unknown in terms of moving to the solution to the problem. But it's very clear the private sector has to be involved in the solution. It's very clear that competition is a good thing, as much competition as possible. If you're trying to do renewables and non-renewables, as almost all countries in the region are trying to do, you have to have a diversity of supply. And fixing the tariff, hard as it is really another bedrock reform. It has to create the financial viability that will make the sector investable. One other point I would make that helps in this context is we're finding that the first thing to do, if it's not already been done, is to help the government create a master plan for the power sector. In which the government thinks through the issues of renewable versus non-renewables, grid versus off-grid, domestic power generation versus being part of a regional power pool.
Right.
So you can, and obviously master plans have short-term solutions and they have long-term solutions. In some cases, the off-grid is the right short-term solution, but over time you want to move to a grid. But if you think those things through, then that gives you a set of objectives, and you can build a set of policies and institutional reforms that get you to those objectives. If you don't start with a master plan, you're often in a circumstance where you're being reactive, and it's very hard to be reactive in the power sector where the decisions you make today really won't be actually implemented for many years.
Thank you. Professor Lyakurwa, Nancy here says it's mainly at times because governments are uncertain on the issue of whether there will be enough generation of power. Is that all? Or really, at times, the truth is, it's political. Every administration is 5 years life cycle. They want to make sure that they get the votes. The private sector comes in. We don't have control of this special and strategic asset, and it should be just left to the unknown. So is it both, or is it more political?
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. It's difficult to say either or. But let me just dwell a little bit on the subject. the role of government is essentially to ensure that the welfare of its citizens is attained. So we have that as an objective of government. In other territories, in the territory I'm aware of, there's a government strategy to move towards industrialization. And to move towards industrialization, you need power. Power to power the industries, but power to light up the country. And from the country I am, we are a deficit country in terms of power. As I speak, less than 40% of the country has access to electricity. Less than 40%. And you can look at the AFD map for the case of Tanzania to see where the country stands. Now, unfortunately, this is unfortunate, we have more or less one institution that generates, produces, and distributes power. Now, with that kind of a model, first with the deficit and the need to reach out, there are elements of subsidies in the system which have built over time. I don't want to go to the model that Ntuli has raised. I'll leave that for now. But even that particular model is supported by independent power producers who are supplying electricity to the national grid. The problem here is the independent power producers have, how would I call it, have managed to shortchange the institution for two main reasons. One, because of lack of technical competence to negotiate contracts. But two, because of corruption, and I can say it openly. Corruption in the system, we are likely to have contracts that are skewed in favor of independent power producers. At one point, power from the independent power producers was costing us about 45 cents per unit. Who can afford that? And you talk of the parastatal going bankrupt. If they have to pay 45 cents per unit and sell it to the public at 14 cents, truly he's a finance guy. He'll tell you what that means.
Huge loss.
Huge losses. They have, the institution has built up huge losses. What is the way forward? The way forward, in my opinion, is for the government or the institution to ring-fence that big loss and issue a bond, given that it is beginning to make money, issue a bond, long-term bond, make money currently for the institution to be profitable, and have the bond paid in 20 years to meet the shortfall, which is essentially what I would think would be the right way to go, rather than having an institution which is bloated with huge deficits which it cannot meet for the time being. Second, having an institution which does the three things: generate, distribute, transmit, it's not the most efficient way. There is need, as Professor Ntuli has indicated, to decongest the system. I call it decongest the system by allowing other players, private players, to get into particularly the generation part. You can leave the distribution part, which is a more difficult sector to get in, but the generation of electricity should essentially be decongested from the national parastatal into private players. And hopefully then, this national parastatal will be able to operate at a profit, meet the objective of satisfying the welfare of the nation, as well as powering the country towards industrialization.
Thank you very much, Prof. Now, Mr. Mundende, everything that's been said here by your other three panelists speaks to you seated that national utility that probably is playing this all-involving role, and that the Professor Liakulwa is saying, let's decongest it. Is it because it's easy to sit as the professor here, you can just say it, most you are there every day, you have to deal with these issues, you see it from a different angle?
Thank you very much. I'll try to speak from the utility point of view and perhaps give examples of our experience in Zambia. Firstly, I tend to agree with all the previous speakers. I think they have raised key issues in this industry. From the utility point of view, ZESCO firstly is vertically integrated, and obviously the role of government is key to the parastatal. As ZESCO, we have partnered with other players in generation to develop power plants. We've recently, in January, commissioned Iteshi, which is a 120 megawatts power station, which we partnered with Tata Africa. Obviously, the experience of partnering is, since it was our first PPP in Zambia in generation, it had its own challenges, which we had to overcome. ADB is one of the key four financiers to that plant. I think in order to power Africa, there's need to ensure that all those potential sites are fully developed. The model for us could be either wholly owned by government or private. We could partner with any private players, or private players themselves, they could take up any plant. The government of the Republic of Zambia liberalized the energy sector as early as 1996 by creating the Office of Promoting Private Power Investment, or PPPI. Unfortunately, there was not much investment between 1996 and to date, which is probably 30 years, because I think there were a lot of challenges, mainly largely due to the tariff. There was no appetite for investment because the tariff was not so good. But I fully agree that as we are developing the generation, we need to side by side look at the transmission, because most of the players would want to have the transmission in place, already developed. If you look at the transmission in our side, in Zambia, we have a policy of open access. So the transmission is liberalized. Anyone can hook into our transmission. However, the market is liberalized. An independent power producer can go and look for his own market. And of course, as a public utility, as an off-taker to that IPP, who will the power to there. But the public off-taker has become like a de facto single buyer, you know, because for the simple reason that the market and the pricing structure is not commercially configured. The IPPs would rather go to the public off-taker, in this case, which is ZESCO Limited, as opposed to go into the market, because there they'll find the price at a different level. So there, that's where we have the challenges. If at all we could...
Are you saying it's not regulated?
The regulation is there, but we don't have a feed-in tariff to say. We look at case by case. But if we buy the power, we won't buy at the market price. That's why we're saying, look, the single buyer model is not a policy.
But by default,
by default.
This is what's happening.
Yes, by default, precisely, absolutely. That is what is happening.
I think we should hold your thought. I want to come maybe to Professor Ncube, because you mentioned this. Let's use this as a study case, Prof, and say what's going right here and what's going wrong in this setup. Because then I suppose we can solve other issues. I know, Nancy, you also mentioned that. I can come to you after Professor Ncube. I'm a bit confused on how the whole thing works on the Zambian situation. But I think it's a good case to look at, because it sounds like, from what I heard from Emily, from everybody here, that's where we could actually untangle things. So what's working and what probably could be bettered in this situation?
I think what could be bettered here is just opening up, as I said earlier, on the generation front, just making sure that there are enough players can come in to bolster generation capacity. But at the same time, once you do that, then the utility or the government has to invest more in transmission and distribution capacity. They have to go hand in hand. Perhaps there's a way in which, in this PPP arrangement or something, there's a way in which we combine transmission investment with generation investment. It's never easy, but it's something to reflect on, because governments would have to invest quite a bit in that area. On the issue of the single buyer, I'm just thinking here, the point that Nancy raised about the MCC model, where you want to be sure that in the power purchase agreement, the PPA agreement, the tariffs are set at the right level, or they're competitive. No one is getting ripped off, but also government has real capacity to negotiate properly with anyone who's supplying into the grid. I think there's a whole issue about whether Zambia has the right capacity to, within government, to negotiate those PPA agreements in a way that they're not being ripped off. I think this is what Bill also raised with the Tanzania case. In fact, I'll recall, this is public information, when we wanted to extend the loan to the Tanzania utility, and one of the things that slowed us down as a bank was the debt that was sitting, which is now suggesting that it should be hived off and maybe subsumed by central government. Just take it off, subsumed by central government, off balance sheet from the utility, clean it up, and then it can get back to profitability. I think that's the way to go. But quite clearly, something about the pricing, the agreements, the tariffs, it needs to be looked into. There's one issue that I also wanted Victor to maybe elaborate on, which was the nature of the subsidy when it comes to distribution. Because that puts fiscal pressures on government. This whole issue of subsidies. You know what? When people have no power, they invest in their own generators. Diesel power, back when the oil price was $100 per barrel, it's cheaper now, but it used to be very expensive electricity. So people, if they have no power, are willing to spend more on power. So sometimes I think there's a question to be raised about subsidies on these for the citizens. I think we need to reflect on that. I think maybe you could lower those subsidies, or in some cases remove them completely, because citizens are willing to pay more if there's a deficit. But if you remove those subsidies, then you must make sure that they get their power. They get the power, so they don't have to invest in private generation.
Sure. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to react. because I've been requested anyway.
Then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much. I take the point on the PPAs and maybe just a quick reaction before I come to the subsidies. In our case, I think we have dedicated teams that do the negotiations for PPAs, and it's not done at government level. It's done within the utility. And if you look at the tariffs with the PPP, the public-private producers, with the independent private power producers, I think the tariffs are very well structured. Okay. The only issue we have as a country is the selling price to the domestic, to the mining customers. Our tariffs are around 10 and below 10 from the supplier's point of view. But again, we are selling below, for between 4 to 6 cents. So the selling price is rather on the low side. Now, coming to the issue of subsidies, in our case, we are not getting subsidies from government. What we did was to work with the World Bank, and we got the loan to government and on lent to ZESCO at a very nominal interest to government. That worked very, very well, and we raised I think our customer base was somewhere around 470,000 customers. We're now sitting at 760,000 customers. But again, that was like shooting ourselves in the foot, because from last year we started experiencing the crisis, and we could not give power to the people. Our peak demand is well below our capacity as ZESCO. Right. But because of the climate change, we had to go into massive load shedding, such that at the moment we are generating less than half of our capacity. We are generating less than half. The issue of subsidies worked very, very well, and this project actually came to an end in January this year. For us, it's an issue of banks like African Development Bank, even commercial banks, maybe to come in and see how we can structure this, and try to have more access. But again, you can't just have access, you don't have power, as it were. Within ourselves in ZESCO, we have the Luapula River sites, which are about 5 or so. We are working with our colleagues in DRC to ensuring that we construct the 1,200 megawatt capacity sites, which we have already signed the government intergovernmental memorandum of understanding, interutility. The teams are already in place. With Zimbabwe, we are about to commence the Batoka, which is 2,400, 1,002 on either side. I think what we need to do is to ensure that we develop the generation. For the transmission, we have got about 4 big projects which have already been signed to the tune of almost $1 billion US dollars, which will commence quickly. What we have noticed for the renewables is that the places where we could hook up, the grid is so weak, it requires strengthening. Yep. In fact, for the renewables, we have a challenge such that we can't hook up so much because we're predominantly hydro. We're 99% hydro, and the rule of the thumb will tell you that you can only hook up 10 to 15% of renewables to hydro. So in that regard, we have commissioned a study with Obama Powering Africa Initiative. So there's a consultant who's trying to do some system studies to see how best we can, which place can we inject, and how much can we inject. Thank you so much.
You want to make a comment, Nancy? And then we can move on.
Yeah, no, this is, I think this is a great conversation. So let me just cover our experience on 3 points. One, the health of the utilities themselves. Second, the tariff issue. And third, this question of structuring PPPs.
We find in all of the countries we're working in the power sectors, the financial health of the utility and the operating efficiency of the utility is a fundamental issue. It is across the board the case. There are always arrears which burden the institution. Often they are arrears generated within governments because government ministries are not paying their utility bills. So it becomes a fiscal/political issue to clear those arrears. You could have an arrangement, as you were suggesting, to sort of a kind of a backward-looking arrangement and a forward-looking arrangement. You could somehow take those arrears and make them a fiscal issue a bond, or somehow deal with them through your fiscal resources. But moving forward, you have to find a way both to have ministries consistently pay for power, but also have a billing system that works and a metering system that works. So these fundamental building blocks of a market, of a transaction, are just not there. So, so far we've spent roughly $500 million just on policy and institutional reform alone in Africa, and a lot of it is addressing those problems. Similarly, tariffs are always a problem, and the government is focused on that problem and wants to establish a tariff setting process that does recover costs, that gets adjusted in the right way over time with an independent regulator that makes decisions based on the viability of the sector as opposed to other considerations. So we find tariff setting always has to be adjusted as part of the process of making the sector viable, but also attracting the private sector, because the private sector looks at those tariffs as a fundamental.
But do you agree with Professor Ncube that they seem to worry about this issue, governments, about issues of tariffs? But as he rightly said, if there are blackouts, people will pay $100 for the diesel and buy generators. Is that really an issue to worry about, or maybe it's just imagined?
I thought that was an excellent point. I was going to come to that, which is it's what we call the willingness to pay. For every project we help to finance, we do a cost-benefit analysis, and we assess the benefit stream to the users of power based on their willingness to pay. And often the benefit is in the form of supplying power at a price lower than the demonstrated willingness to pay, the demonstrated willingness to pay being power usage that is through high-cost diesel or other sources. So we know people are paying for power, and part of the function of these investments is to give them a source of power that's actually cheaper than what they're cheaper and more reliable than what they're currently using. However, that doesn't address the problem of access and very poor households. So you want some kind of way, if you're going to set access as your goal, to use effectively targeted subsidies for these basic levels of usage, but they should be subsidies targeted at low levels of usage. You should not subsidize usage as it expands. And then the one other point I wanted to make is that on this question of PPPs, PPPs are a complicated instrument, and governments need a kind of objective, unbiased, disinterested source of advice. First of all, when to use PPPs as opposed to concessions or some others.
Disinterested advice?
We view that as one of our functions as a donor. We should provide funding, grants, so that governments can hire consultants that are working for governments and consultants that are really interested in the right sharing of risks, the right sharing of liabilities, so that the things can be structured in a way that are sustainable. So I do think that that's a role for donors. And so that's exactly what we've done. We've seen this need, and we've set aside, particularly for Africa, about $50 million in financing just for that alone, and we expect that in itself will help bring some PPP transactions to market and actually create the kind of leverage of private resources that I think we're all agreed is necessary.
Professor Lyakuru, I want to bring you in here more to also add to this point, but to then give a country specific in Tanzania on whether it relates to what is happening in Zambia.
Well, the situation in Tanzania is not very different from the Zambian case. The difference here is that of late, Tanzania has discovered natural gas. Yes. And natural gas is increasingly being used to generate electricity. With natural gas, as opposed to hydro or thermal, the price is going down. So, where I mentioned the case of PPPs charging 45 cents, when you switch from thermal to gas, the price goes down significantly. So there is, also hydro is a difficult problem right now because of climate change. The electricity company produces just about 50% of the total electricity through hydro, and the rest is thermal. So two things affect the price of electricity. One, the climate change. Two, the price of oil. But fortunately, currently, the price of oil is going down. Hydro is a big problem, but the discovery of gas has made it cheaper to produce electricity, and electricity now is being hooked to the independent power producers who will produce electricity and sell it to the national grid at a negotiated price. I have to add here, however, that because of the problems I've mentioned in terms of technicalities, technical competence, as well as potential risk of corruption, the World Bank and the African Development Bank have come in to assist the National Utility Company to come out with a strategy on how to price electricity efficiently so that at least it gets the best price from the independent power producers, as well as the price it can charge to the customers. We have a regulatory authority, of course, on electricity, but regulation in the presence of shortages doesn't work very well. You regulate what if it's not relevant?
Nothing. That's true. Professor Ncube, Mr. Mdende, and also Professor Lyakuru is raising the issue of El Nino, La Nina, so climate change, and we having those issues. I'm not quite sure whether I picked up on what was the issue and then connecting if we're talking about other issues of integrated approaches to renewable energy on and off grid. What's your thought on that?
When it comes to hydro, obviously there is a challenge with the drought in southern Africa. It's a real problem, absolutely. But there are some countries in Africa that are more fortunate, where the climate is a friend. Let's take Cape Verde, for instance, which has invested massively in wind farms. The Kabioleka project, in which the AFDB is one of the investors, along with AFC. I think there's European Development Bank as well in there. That is working quite well, and I think the numbers I have is 45% of the power to the country now comes from that wind farm facility, and it could grow, it could double, frankly, and move closer to 80, 90%. So that's a fortunate situation where an issue of renewable energy is a key source of energy, and the country is moving away from diesel generated energy to wind. If you look at Morocco, where again, if you look at the new solar complex near Ozazat, that has become a major a source of energy in Morocco, and Morocco is very clear about its energy strategy, how to deal with renewables. In fact, if I can think of another country which is very clear about integrating renewables, it's South Africa. South Africa and Morocco are very clear strategies, and you can see the results. And that Ouarzazate complex is an incredible project. Kenya as well. I think the strategy is reasonably clear in terms of integrating renewables, whether it's Lake Turkana, project which is generating power there, as well as the geothermal energy. It looks like the strategy is also together. I'm less clear on Ethiopia because it too has a great potential on the geothermal front. Maybe I just need to read the right documents, talk to the right ministers, but I'm less clear that they are clear on the strategy. If you look at South Africa, the potential for wind energy in the Northern Cape region is huge. In fact, it is going to probably overtake the Lake Turkana project in Kenya. There's a huge investment that's going to go in there, and there's a great potential. But quite clearly, the country must have a strategy for incorporating renewable energies. It involves some investments, it involves some regulation, and some countries are more fortunate that that's the only source of energy.
So what you're saying is that there is an opportunity there. But I've been having discussions here, and what you get to hear mainly, especially from governments, is that it's costly. And we want to industrialize. We're not just talking about lighting up small houses. So how do we then become innovative in finding and tapping into new ways of financing, especially renewable energy?
That's right. I've just joined the board of a new renewable fund in the UK, in London. And I mean, private equity investment is still a source of financing for investment in renewables and traditional energy. Absolutely, that's still a source of capital. But for me, where I've been disappointed, Daniel, is really the speed with which the markets have failed to create the infrastructure asset class as an investment asset class. I'm actually baffled why we're not making progress. When I spoke to some colleagues on the street at Carlisle, they told me that, you know what, truly, maybe the problem is that what we're missing is hungry investment bankers who can create the same thing that they did for the mortgage-backed securities, which crashed the U.S. housing market, but do it for the infrastructure asset class, so that we can move faster and make sure this asset class develops, and then pension funds, the long-term investors, can then begin to invest in it. So I think that there is a role for the pension funds, investors, for brokers, but also for investment bankers to get involved in this market.
But why are they not hungry then? These investment banks?
I don't know. So just one more point.
Yeah.
There's also something that perhaps is less applicable. At least if I see that in the US, maybe Nancy can confirm, which is an approach for investing in infrastructure around energy projects. It could be buildings, it could be that. You could have a different investor just investing in that kind of infrastructure. Those structures, instruments are called yield calls. That's one instrument. I don't know if any African country that is using them. Maybe I just haven't been keeping up, but clearly that's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Nancy wanted to jump in.
Yeah. Nancy, come in, and then I'll move to
Nancy.
Professor. I'll come to you.
Just 2 points to add to that. And again, going back to the utility as the off-taker of renewables as well as non-renewables. What we've seen is a lot of deals founder at the debt stage because there's a lack of confidence in the utility as the off-taker of the renewable source of power. And in part, that relates to grid issues. As this is not cost-free, the grid has to be adjusted so that it's capable of absorbing that power. So there have to be grid investments that parallel the investments in the renewables. But the renewable companies are prepared to move forward with innovative approaches. but they need a reliable off-taker and they need reliable access to the grid, and that's also a question of rules.
But Nancy, if they're already operating below capacity, there's space there to feed in from renewable, isn't there?
No.
Or am I being simplistic about the issue?
Just
No, I mean, I think there's a universal shortage of generation capacity of one form or another. So I think renewables have to make up the mix of generation capacity. But then the other point I wanted to make on renewables in particular is you need a regulatory environment, especially if some of the renewables are going off for off-grid purposes, that's appropriate for off-grid. The regulatory approach for grid and off-grid probably does not need to be the same and probably should not need to be the same. What we're finding is you need a relatively light touch on regulation on off-grid so that you can encourage these kinds of innovation, new business models, so that businesses actually come forward with options for off-grid solutions that are cost-efficient. So it's somewhat similar to the financial sector, where we saw a lot of innovation in financial services being provided through mobile phones, particularly in countries where the regulatory approach was pretty flexible in the beginning. And I think we need that in the power sector.
I have a double-hander.
Okay.
Just to challenge my worthy colleague Nancy on something she said about that the financial health of the utility is impacting on the ability to originate debt. That is partly true. But look, at the end of the day, even if you're an equity-type investor, you still need to get paid, right? So it still matters. In fact, for what it's worth, I remember us having a big debate at the African Development Bank. I can say so now. I left, so fair to say. We have to worry about contract renewal. So about how to construct the Africa 50 Fund, right? Which is the fund launched to fund infrastructure. And my argument was, you know what, we want to make sure that this fund has a very large debt component. The reason being that you want to attract short-term liquidity investors like central banks. Central banks they need liquidity. If you want their money, if you want to attract the government of Algeria sitting on $200 billion, they have a lot of money in terms of the foreign reserves, they need liquidity, and yet for that they need a fixed income instrument. Hopefully it's well rated, and the bank can then perhaps lend its AAA rating onto that special purpose vehicle that is managing the Africa 50. I'm just thinking that whether Nancy, it's a debt instrument or equity instrument, the issue of utility still matters either way. But I think it's about us being creative in understanding who the market is, who can invest, and what sort of instruments they need. I just feel that we're not doing enough in originating debt instruments as an asset class within the infrastructure space.
Sure. Did you want to say, Prof, or Mr. Mdende?
I think the points are noted. Just to comment perhaps on the issue of the appetite. This has been partly answered by Prof himself, Prof Ncube. What is lacking in most of our utilities? I can talk of the southern power pool. In the southern part, it's what has been alluded to earlier. We don't have sort of a plan, a strategy on how to integrate these renewables. And so for us, we recognized from our regional SAPP, Southern African Power Pool, that we required to do system studies. The issue is, at utility level, let's say we have solar. Solar is not very predictable. It's if you look at the load curve, it's not constant. So what that tells you is that then you have to have a lot of spinning, what we refer to as spinning reserve. Spinning reserve is you have to have a machine or so which can take up if there's those variability. But in this case, during this time, you cannot afford to have at utility level spinning reserve. It means you're running water through your machine, but that machine is not contributing to your load. It's just available in case of anything. Anyhow, the beauty of interconnectivity, the regional interconnectivity, is that the SAP itself affords you some spinning reserve. But so once, that's why we said in our case like ZESCO, we have already engaged some consultants who are looking at, once those plans are available, I think it will be easier to sell them to the banks and so on and so forth. They need to see, the banks also have to do due diligence and see, are they willing to give you that money. I quickly want to comment on what was talked about commercial viability by Nancy Lee. Just our experience. In our case, I think our experience is the debt which we assumed as a utility, sort of an historic debt. In terms of current status, I think we have no problems because we build state house, we build hospitals, we build the airport, we build the government offices. They have meters in the government offices. Sometimes you get calls, say, look, the lift is not working. I say, have you checked your meter? You see. So I think the issue...
You build them, do they pay them?
Because it's a meter. If they don't pay, it switches off automatically.
Okay.
So my point is, I think where we have challenges is the historic debt, and maybe that's where we would need people to help us to see how we could sort of resolve that debt.
I think Professor Ncube raised an issue on being creative about this. Did I hear you right, Prof, when you were talking about maybe get it off the books, clear it?
Being innovative on funding.
Yes.
Yeah.
But quickly, maybe I could also say, just to finish this point I was making, the other challenge we have in terms of, just to answer Nancy Lee, is the water utilities. Because they quickly, you can't, there's a problem there. Thank you.
What's the problem? Yes, indeed.
No,
I just want to tell Nancy before you make a comment. We are left with 45 minutes. We're soon to get into the time where we will then ask our audiences here to ask questions. May they be questions rather than long comments, and because we really want to interact with the panelists and come up with tangible proposals and ideas on how to move forward. So prepare yourselves. Don't wait for warming up because we don't have a lot of time. Just get into it. So, yes, Nancy.
No, I just was going to joke because we happen to be doing a large-scale water and sanitation compact in Zambia, and I have heard about these issues with power supply in that context.
Thank you. Maybe the issue of leveraging regional power pools, it came up and maybe not so, but we didn't delve into it deeper. How much are they a help in a situation where we are really suffering? Where are we not crafting it correctly in order really to feed to the grid? Prof. Liakuru.
I guess as Professor Ndule has alluded to, I will come in only in the case of the East Africa system, where I know the best. It so happens that is it on?
I think the one on your ear is now working.
Okay.
Am I correct? Okay.
It so happens that almost all the countries concerned.
Gentlemen, which one should we use? The handheld? Handheld. Prof. Thank you.
Okay. Almost all the countries in East Africa have a deficit in electricity. Tanzania imports power from Zambia. It also imports power from Uganda, but it exports power to Kenya. Now look at the configuration. Just look at that configuration.
Yes.
Now, Zambia is currently facing significant
Indeed, export.
problems when exporting power to Tanzania.
audio. Yeah.
Uganda similarly is facing problems in terms of exporting power to Tanzania. Tanzania is at the same time facing difficulty exporting power to Kenya. But we have contracts between these countries of exporting power to each other. How do you resolve this problem here? At least in the short term, it's a problem because we have El Nino, which is affecting all the countries concerned. In the long term, at least there is gas in Tanzania, which is increasingly being used to generate electricity. Actually, the government has completed about 600 kilometer gas pipeline from Twara to Dar es Salaam. It's already fed into the main grid. And that's why I mentioned that about the electricity company being a bit more liquid now than it was before. And you could actually live on Ntuli's suggestion of issuing a long-term bond to take care of the history. And as well, get some of the banks, including the Development Bank, to finance the power company because it's beginning to show profitability. But the issue of a regional power pool is a complicated issue in the context of East Africa because all countries are power deficit, although they have agreements to sell power to each other, but they're short. How you resolve that particular scenario, I don't know.
So, Mdeni, maybe you could tell us, in a situation of a crisis, is there a clause that says if we have a crisis, maybe we should stop supplying other countries and look after ourselves?
Thank you. Well, in a situation of a crisis, there's provisions in the contracts where you can declare force majeure, for instance. And in that way, in that fashion, what then happens is that you may not stop supplying, but you may reduce significantly the supply to those countries. In this case, Zambia is in a, fortunate because we are surrounded by 8 neighbors, and for us, our vision is to be a hub of electricity trade. All our neighboring countries, our towns on the borders are supplied from Zambia, except for one.
Is that not a disease of our countries, Mr. Mdeni, if I may come in? You have countries that say, just to deviate a bit, that say, oh, we'll continue flying the flag of our airline, but that airline is bleeding, actually is running on zero. Is that not an issue? You have a dream.
Yeah, for me, actually,
the moment you're not powering your country.
This is a transient, it's not a state value. It's just, I think this is also timely because, you see, certain things wouldn't have come in effect. Sometimes you have to be pushed to the wall if you are too much in a comfort, you don't do things. For us, we have taken this as a very huge opportunity. I can tell you, talking from Zambia's point of view, that even in the biggest hurdle that we have, which is a tariff, most of the people are willing now to increase. I think the Zambians want to increase the tariff. But you see, you have to go through certain situations for you to realize that because if you talk to the people and tell them that this is the cheapest source, if anything, Zambia is the cheapest supplier of electricity in the whole region, probably the whole Africa. Our tariffs are the least. But if you talk to the people, they still feel they're paying enough, maybe because the incomes are low, maybe because of other factors. But again, I think for us, we know that it is not going to be there forever. It is just, and it has presented a lot of opportunities. All we have to do is what Professor said, create that appetite for investment now, because it's an opportunity. The window can just go out and you remain in low tariffs, remain with lack of investment, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. Are there questions from the floor? If there are any, please, I'll come. But just before I go to the floor, Prof, I need to ask you, Prof. Liakuru. Mr. Mdende says, you need to be pushed in a corner. I don't know where he's leaving room for planning in that process. The Great Lakes region we could do more on hydro, or couldn't we? if we planned properly?
Tariff.
Well, the Great Lakes region, yes. I mean, if you take Zaire, for instance, as part of the Great Lakes region, then you have a big source of hydropower there. But Zaire is a complicated place. For now, it is not connected to the grid system as Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda is, because at least these countries are already connected and it's easy to buy and sell electricity to each other. The distances to the source of electricity in Zaire, I don't know. From the source.
I think the Congolese will not be very happy with you calling it Zaire.
DRC. Yeah, you're right. From DRC to the neighboring countries, I don't know. But the problem here is more political than economic.
Just one point on power pools. One of the reasons, it's like analogous to trade generally. At the moment you have a situation in the East African power pool where you have essentially a shortage of electricity, and so you don't have a surplus to export. But one of the virtues of a pool is in the scale of investment that a pool makes possible. You want, if you're creating a regional market, larger investments that achieve economies of scale, greater efficiency, and lower costs make economic sense because you're talking about a market that's much bigger. So and that really should not be underestimated as a motivation and as an organizing principle around regional integration of power markets in the future.
I wanted to say the same thing as Nancy, to say, look, the fact that East Africa has a deficit, no one is trading with anyone, is actually a signal, because one of the roles of a power pool is to signal what needs to be done. It means that there should be more investment in other forms of energy and in generation, absolutely. That's the signal. And just an anecdote on the Inga Dam project. You know that the what really triggered everything, now we're beginning to see some movement, was South Africa. Because for the longest while, we needed a large off-taker to kind of commit to make the project viable. But also, we just needed a change of thinking, which is to see the Inga Dam as a regional project rather than as a national project because of its capacity. And then thinking regional about it helped a lot. And then South Africa and DRC signed that MOU, 2.5 years ago now. And then that triggered movement. And then now you've got DFIs putting more money for the feasibility studies and so forth and so forth. But your point about generally the Great Lakes, there's great potential for hydro, for different falls here and there. But also you begin to see the use of interesting technology. I mean, what's this? Was it the Kivu Watt project in Rwanda, where I know the bank is involved, is invested in that as well. Harnessing that methane gas from the lake and then using the right technology to convert that to power generation. There's a lot of potential, absolutely. So, and the deficit within the East Africa Power Pool is signaling that more should be done to invest in that capacity in East Africa.
Okay. Questions? I'll start with you, sir, and then I'll come to you. Please tell us your name and whom you're directing the question to. And as I said, one question per person. Go ahead, and then I'll come to you. Thank you. Could we get the second question? Yeah, you, sir.
Hi, my name is Bertrand Uge, Managing Director of Tendi Group in Nigeria. So my question really seems like we are offering a luxury product.
To whom?
Are you to anyone in the panel. We are offering a luxury product at an affordable rate. I'm talking more of tariffs now and also subsidies for government. Is there room for clustering, with consumers who have different willingness to pay? Is there a room to cluster this so that the prices are different? So, for example, I live in Nigeria and I have 24/7 light, 7 days a week. And that's because we live in what's called gated communities or estates that has 1,000 homes that is powered by diesel generators. And we're probably spending maybe 20 or 30 naira more than what the local generating power is given. So I don't know if that's something the governments can do in terms of clustering, the segments of consumers and offering that power at different rates with people who have the different willingness to pay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Yes, ma'am. And then we'll go to the panel.
Hello, Susan Lasecki with Hope Energy, CEO. I've got a comment and a question, and they're related. The first one is we keep talking about the high cost of energy from renewables, but every fact I've read has said that it's now cost competitive. And the question around, are we looking at the total cost of ownership of non-renewable sources compared to renewables, like what's happening with diesel generators, and then getting to what the real cost competitiveness is? But also in the mix, nobody's talking about biomass. And biomass is a way of creating a lot of jobs, actually sucking up CO2 and delivering baseload power. That plus waste to energy, and waste is another big issue on this continent. Why aren't we talking about that alongside of solar and wind?
Thank you. All right. Most questions were all directed to the panelists, so who wants to start? You want to start, bro? Yeah. No? You start.
No, I just picked
we'll
up the microphone.
We'll let the lady start. I mean, she's already outnumbered here. So.
To answer the first question about what's necessary to bring this vision to reality, I would say that what we're challenged to do as development institutions is to bring all of the elements together that really that create the critical mass. We've talked here about 4 elements. First, the policy and regulatory environment. Second, the institutional strengthening and reform. Third, the actual investment in countries where fiscal space is limited, supplementing public resources or doing viability gap finance. But fourth, investing in the pipeline of bankable projects. So I would argue that all 4 of those things are necessary. And I think for MCC's perspective, since we bring large-scale grants to the table, we have a lot of flexibility to respond to need. Our compacts increasingly have all 4 of those elements, whereas in the past we might have just invested in the infrastructure. Now we bring those elements together. But it doesn't we need to build partnerships across the development finance institutions so we can bring all of those tools to the table. On the question of price differentiation, I think that's a really good point. I think it is possible, and that was partly why I mentioned earlier this notion of a light touch in regulation for off-grid. There are off-grid, the renewable energy sources. One of the many good things about them is, for solar in particular, they can operate at small scale or they can operate at utility scale. So in some cases, you're going to, in off-grid solutions, you're going to have different prices in different areas, depending on the nature of the technology, the size of the market, et cetera. And the regulatory environment should allow that to happen in order to encourage innovation. Down the road, there may be some attempt at greater uniformity, but I think price differentiation will be a driver of innovation and of investment going forward. And I think that relates to the question about biomass. I think it very much in rural areas in particular is a viable source of not just household or farm level energy provision, but mini grid, nano grids, which can be a very efficient source of energy, but also of fertilizer, a kind of little ecosystem of supplying the needs of local rural areas. People sort of make a distinction between what's scalable and what's not scalable. I think that's becoming less and less relevant now, because I think you're going to want mixes of solutions, some of which you can do at scale and some of which are you can do at small scale, but you can do it in a commercially viable way.
Just to add to what Nancy is saying, for the bank to achieve Adeshina's high five, the first high five, I think just focusing on a lot more on off-grid energy technology is one way forward. And I know that the bank is wired to think on-grid. That's what we do. But off-grid is really important. That includes the biomass, absolutely. So is the solar-based energy for rural homes, biomass, and just finding a way to invest in that, work with government, invest in that, to really massify, scale that up, I think will help achieve the high five. I think I was listening to one of the elevator pitches in one session I attended this morning, where this gadget that's being sold in Zambia, a local company, you have a solar panel with a battery for storage, and also you go to all manner of USB, sockets into it, comes with a radio, and all for $175. Surely a rural people can afford that. Equally, in terms of biomass opportunities, generation opportunities, they can be assisted in terms of generating their own power. So off-grid is the buzzword for achieving this high five. I think the differential tariffs, I totally agree. On the issue of US dollarized, US dollar denominated tariffs, that's an interesting challenge. In areas where you find the investment is in US dollars for generation and so forth, in the PPP, wherever, frankly, but the tariffs are in local currency. Now, how do you recover in order to, from the consumers and be able to service US dollar loans? That's often a challenge. I've seen structures in Uganda where the role of effectively hedging the exchange rate risk is done by DFIs. I know there's a project, just need to remember the name now, where the Norwegian NORAD, Norwegian government, working with the German development bank KWF. That's it, KWF.
KFW.
My German is not great. So in the idea there was to overlay literally an exchange rate hedging mechanism that allows the initial investors in the project to receive basically effectively $1 tariffs on the back of a local shilling tariff structure. Yeah. So maybe there's a role for DFIs to play that role in markets where you can't even hedge. It's almost an effective subsidy to consumers for a US dollar tariff when they can afford it.
Before you hand over the mic to the prof next to you, Professor Ncube, what would you say to people when you advocate the issue of off-grid, and as you say, the FDB would be more wired to on-grid, who say, well, if you want to industrialize, we got to go mega, as it were, as far as...
But frankly, we have to do both. We have to do both. All I'm saying that let's also be wired as well off-grid. I mean, that's all I'm saying, that off-grid, on-grid should be part of the struggle.
Okay.
But I think about it, in the peri-urban areas, in the huge slums of Nairobi there, well, you're not going to get on-grid power very easily. It's going to be off-grid. So even in the urban areas, you still need some off-grid power to power those hairdressing salons and other things and so forth.
But clearly you need more. All I'm saying, yeah.
I think a lot has been said about the questions raised, but I just want to dwell on one, which is the very important issue of pricing, the differential pricing. It's already happening, actually, in the case of Tanzania, where rural energy is priced differently from urban energy. And I can give an example. I have a home in the rural areas, and I have a home in Dar es Salaam. When I buy electricity for my house in Dar es Salaam, I am charged a certain percentage, which goes towards rural energy. And when I buy fuel for my car in Dar es Salaam, a certain percentage is charged to go for rural energy. So the price I pay for my house in Dar es Salaam is different from the price I pay for my home in the rural area. So it is working. And this is what was being financed by, and Nancy knows very well about rural electrification in Tanzania.
And you're okay with that?
Very okay with
that. He's actually subsidizing the rural homes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Mdede.
Thank you. I think it's good to note the last point. Probably we'll share that with the authorities here so that we could. I think in our case it's a flat rate. Anyhow, for what could be done for these markets, I think from the utility point of view is to ensure that we have a cost-reflective tariff. I think that will raise the appetite for investors to invest in this industry. The key for us, I think, is just to have a cost-reflective tariff. A tariff at 5 to 6 cents, I think, is nowhere near cost reflectivity. The PPAs, dollarized PPAs, I think in our case, when the investment is in dollars, like for the mines, then the PPAs will be in dollars. If it's in local, then so we don't have much of a problem. It was a problem when an SI was passed that everything should be in Kwacha. Then it became a problem, but then there were exemptions that we had to seek and were granted. Yes, I agree that off-grid, why we have to do both on and off-grid, I think if you have to have access to electricity to a lot of, especially rural people, off-grid is the solution. On-grid, big projects are just for big cooperatives, and that's it. It's not meant for other, and the access will ever be very low. But if we embark on, like in our case, we have a lot of potential sites in mini and small hydros. I think we have a lot of sites between 1 megawatt to about 15 megawatts. We have a lot of those in the northern part of our country. That is power to the people because they'll be off-grid. The rest of this, they'll just see pylons and that's it. The price differentiation, I think our experience is that we've tried that because most of these plants that we have, our oldest is Vigfors, commissioned in 1935. You find that the price, we can sustain the operations of low pricing in electricity. But for the new plants, the price is different. We've tried to engage the mine and say, look, this is a new mine and there's new plant coming up and this is their price. It has become a challenge. But because the mines have insisted on what they're calling levelized tariff, we are trying to ensure that we can have a price differentiation, but it has presented itself as a challenge. But we try to learn from others, and if there are people with some answers, innovations, they can whisper to us and we can quickly deal with the matter. The other generation mix, the sources of energy, I think waste is what we are trying to embark on. There are some companies that have shown interest to deal with waste energy. Biomass, there was some keen interest, but now it has really... But waste, we saw that from scrap metal waste, we want it because it might clean our cities and everything. So there will be a lot of other benefits. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Question from you, ma'am. And is there another question from the floor? No. Okay, we'll get from you.
Thank you very much. Pamela Kasese-Bwalya from Millennium Challenge Account, Zambia. I hope I'll be allowed to respond to one of the questions that was raised by Managing Director ZESCO on the issue of the water utility having problems and the issue of them getting into prepaid meters. Would I be allowed to now ask the question?
You are allowed.
Yeah, since I'm working with the water utility, I think that the plan by the utility is to install prepaid meters in the city of Lusaka, and they've already started doing that. In government, they have installed bulk prepaid meters, but obviously the problem is different from ZESCO. I think there are a number of issues that the utility is facing in that some of these camps and the police camps and the army barracks, the infrastructure is completely dilapidated for the water, and therefore when we tried to install the bulk prepaid meters, it didn't work because they ended up paying money for water that was not even going into their houses because they're just leakages everywhere. They need to repair the entire infrastructure in these camps. So the plan is there, and through the MCA Zambia Compact that we are implementing is to ensure that prepaid meters are installed. But also the problem of ZESCO is affecting the water utility. I mean, they're not able to pump water to the number of households. So that also affects the operations. But now coming to my questions, I've got one combined in the sense of focusing on the public-private partnerships and the master plans that we talked about. I know I've been involved in my previous job on the issue of public-private partnerships and the importance. Obviously, there is no way that governments will be able to finance huge infrastructure investments in energy, even in water as well. But I wanted to find out from the DFIs what they are doing to support governments to build the capacity. I mean, this is a real issue on public-private partnership and the capacity of officials within government, even in just in parastatals, to negotiate contracts that benefit governments and share the risks, as was mentioned. And then on the issue of master plans as well, it has worked for the water sector. I mean, MCC financed the development of master plans for the water supply, sanitation in Zambia. And what we are seeing is that we are getting more investments from government and also leveraging investments from cooperating partners, because there's a document that outlines all the pipeline investments that are required in the short, medium, and long term. And these master plans are expensive. I don't know what DFIs are doing to actually support this kind of master planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Don't know whether we have DFIs here to answer that question. But,
There's no one out.
I think I was going to say, I was going to use you just to come back to you since you've been in that space. Prof. Nube.
One of the things I did was being from a more knowledge, sort of angle. We introduced actually a training course on PPPs, what it means for government officials. So just simple basic knowledge. What is this all about? What does it take to have a successful PPP? What works, what doesn't work? Which countries can we learn from its best models? Where are the failures? We have the bank has those programs running continuously. But I think that but there are two things that need to happen going forward. One is just to help government build PPP units. What South Africa did was they put up a PPP unit in the National Treasury, but it's up to each government to decide where it wants to situate it. It could be in the Prime Minister's office or again the Ministry of Finance, Treasury, whatever, but some PPP unit. But number two, where the DFIs can help is also just to embed consultants and skills in the PPP unit. The bank has a program where it can embed a consultant with a government for at least 2 years or a maximum of 2 years, but there's a 24-month sum somewhere there. It can do that just to bolster the capacity. But what of course these units have to realize is that it's not just about the PPP unit, it's about pulling in the right skills depending on the project that they're wanting to push forward on a PPP basis. If it's a road, you need different skills for a road compared to electricity, for instance. So you need different skills for different types of infrastructure. It's knowing that, putting in the skills. But where the bank can help is just more knowledge, training, but also capacity building, embedding. I think the issue of embedding individuals, to me, is really, really key. Two bodies working with the, with government of Zambia and its PPP to bolster that capacity. And,
Well, these people you are embedding, Prof, where are they from?
Oh, these are consultants from within Africa who have the experience, and also from outside Africa.
Okay. There's been a narrative, or at least an argument that's been put that when you talk about these huge negotiations, half of the time, maybe the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Infrastructure is one lawyer who's supposed to be an all-rounder, and then the other side comes with a lawyer that is just for a particular issue, and they probably are 7. And I think it goes without saying who's going to win that game.
Yes. I mean, that's it. I mean, the capacity to negotiate, absolutely. So part of the PPP in its role is to identify the lawyers out there who could help the government negotiate with the lawyers of the private operators. Yeah. So it's part of, really, they should understand the ecosystem so required to be effective in delivering on the job of being a PPP unit.
Okay. Yeah, Nancy. Mm-hmm.
I absolutely agree. You have to bring together the capacity building for the unit as well as the actual advice. And I would just add, I think experience has shown is the best way to actually build an effective unit is to walk them through the process of bringing actual transactions to market. Because that's really the only way to learn, but also it builds the understanding and the acceptance of the importance of the PPP unit in its role in the rest of the government, because sometimes there's frictions within governments on who's structuring these kinds of transactions.
Just for this way, in terms of peer learning, just visit the PPP unit in South Africa and the one in Cairo in Egypt.
Okay.
If Zambia is trying to learn, please just go there. See how they're doing.
Okay. There's something probably we might not have spoken about. If we are in this situation where we have this crisis, especially of power, and Prof. Ncube, earlier you said that, but some countries are blessed with some resources whilst we are in the situation of a climate change crunch. How much, I think Mr. Mdende, you alluded to this earlier, how much or how easy is it to then collaborate within member countries to making sure that you see that you generate power using resources from cross-border issues, or is that a problem? You are neighboring with DRC, with the mighty Congo River. Could probably tap into it, or are these huge political issues?
Thank you. For DRC, it was alluded to by Prof. The INGA, for instance. INGA is one of the listed regional projects from the Southern Power Pool, because DRC is a member of the Southern Power Pool. INGA, Batoka, Kaora Bassa, and the Zizabona. Zizabona, that's an interconnector, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia interconnector, Zizabona. So those are listed regional priority projects. Of course, obviously, without the power pool, I think we wouldn't have had the benefit which we are having, all of us in the region. The situation in the region is such that only Mozambique has got excess power. We have got about 12 countries in the power pool. We are 12 from Lesotho all the way to DRC. But only Mozambique has excess power. And because of that, we are able, like Zambia, we have one bilateral where we are taking 200 megawatts from Mozambique. Again, we have been benefiting from the day-ahead market on the Southern African power pool. Obviously, without the power pool, I think we couldn't have been running even the limits that we have been given. For instance, at Kariba, the operators of the dam is the Zambezi River Authority where on the Zambian side we have 1,080 megawatt plant, but we're limited to only generate 350 out of 1,080 because of the water levels. However, we are able to do full blast up to the limit, and on the Kafue River also do full blast, because then the spinning reserve sits with the power pool. If we were not interconnected, then we wouldn't have run to full capacity. So I think there's a huge advantage in belonging to a power pool, because it also enhances relations between all the utilities. I think we have a very, very good working relationship with all the utilities. We're supposed to take about 300 megawatts off peak from Eskom South Africa. But again, the challenge is the constraints to evacuate that power. Sometimes we get a bit, but our central corridor is a fully, the capacity is not there through ZIM. But the interconnector through Namibia were able to get some power. I think the challenges that we have with the power pool is that there's a slow pace to ensure that the projects are realized. I think one of the major issues is that the power pool is not supported financially. So I just call upon the financiers in this room to start talking to our power pool. We have a big project. We are trying to connect at 330 from Kenya through Tanzania into Zambia, which is the KTZ project. For Zambian side, we are now remaining with the last leg of the transmission line, which is from Kasama into Nakonde. We already have a contractor in place, and we are about to, we've done the EIA and all the other initial whatever. Okay. We are about to commence the construction of this line very, very soon. So we'll be connected at a very high voltage all the way. And Kenya is also busy connecting with Ethiopia all the way into. So the Cecil Rhodes dream of Cape to Cairo will be through electricity.
Could be realized.
Yeah, through electricity, thank you.
It had to be a Cecil Rhodes dream. I think we're entering into closing, and what I would want us to do is, the four of you, to just give me a line on your thoughts on what do you think is really the stumbling block in making sure that Africa is powered, and what we can do to making sure that we correct it. In short, and then we're done. I start with you, Nancy.
A long sentence?
Short sentences, please.
Bring all of our tools together, because this is a multifaceted problem. And definitely all of our institutions have to be comfortable with off-grid as well as grid, because off-grid investments can also contribute to growth, and certainly poverty reduction.
Enhance the effectiveness of PPPs as a way to invest in the sector, and to embrace both on-grid and off-grid.
Thank you.
I would only add that to what has been said in terms of the political will across the countries in the region.
Political.
I think over and above all those political stability, we need, I think, cost-reflective tariffs.
Cost-reflective tariffs.
Thank you.
Well, that's where we end it for this discussion. Thank you very much for being such a good... Yes, a round of applause. Our panelist, Mr. Victor Mundende, the Managing Director of ZESCO, which is the utility company here in Zambia, Ms. Nancy Lee, Deputy CEO, Millennium Challenge Corporation. Professor Mthuli Ncube is at Oxford University and former Vice President and the Chief Economist of the AFDB. And Professor William Liakurwa, he is the Chair of Tanzania Investment Bank. A round of applause again, ladies and gentlemen.